Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and we're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. We do hope that everyone is staying safe and staying well. Just some housekeeping before we get started. If you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we offer attendees a certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, you don't have to answer the questions, obviously. And I'd just like to add that in the last couple of webinars, we've had some sound glitches. They're not major, small, but just wanted to make you aware of them. We might have a few here and there. We'll do our best to smooth things out and keep things seamless. Now for today's webinar topic. The statistics about ADHD and living a healthy lifestyle are pretty stark and instructive. If you look at the 4 biggest health risks in the U.S., poor diet, insufficient exercise, obesity, and smoking, ADHD presents a greater risk than all 4 of these concerns combined, according to ADHD expert and researcher Russell Barkley. To varying degrees, ADHD is a factor in many first-order lifestyle behaviors that result in reduced life expectancy. And these behaviors are not likely to improve until the underlying problem, ADHD, is addressed. In other words, treated. The professional influencers who are most likely to have an impact on healthy lifestyle choices, primary care physicians, pediatricians, cardiologists, and other healthcare professionals, often do not look for ADHD as a potential reason for their patients' non-compliance with recommended changes. So we sort of have to empower ourselves by knowing the facts, educating our doctors, and taking consistent control of our lifestyle habits. Ari Tuckman is here today to point us in the right direction. He's the author of 4 books, ADHD After Dark, Better Sex Life, Better Relationship, Understand Your Brain, Get More Done, More Attention, Less Deficit, and Integrative Treatment for Adult ADHD. His More Attention, Less Deficit podcast has more than 100 episodes and more than 2 million downloads. He is a psychologist in private practice in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and a member of the Attitude ADHD Medical Review Panel. You can ask questions of Ari during his presentation, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can after he finishes. If you want to download the slides of this webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you do not see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. So, with all that under our belts and all the housekeeping done, let's get started. Thanks for being here today, Ari, to help us with this really important challenge.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So this is definitely an important topic. So let me just also say for the listeners, I am recording this here locally on a little digital recorder. So if you have issues, if there are issues with network traffic or anything else, fear not. We'll still get a good recording, and you can always download it afterwards. So as Wayne started out telling us, Russell Barkley and some of his colleagues have some new research that's come out that's really important, and it's frankly also kind of scary, truthfully. I'll sort of spare you the dirty details of it, but what's very clear is that ADHD has been found to have a significant negative impact on estimated life expectancy. Now, this is primarily, folks who have untreated or poorly managed ADHD. So, I think that we can say that treatment does have a positive effect on this, but it impacts not only how many years people live, but it also impacts their healthy years, meaning being alive, but really kind of limited in terms of what you're able to do. I mean, okay, yes, you're still alive. That's good. But you're not exactly like, going for a hike and chasing the grandkids and other things like that. So both total years, but also healthy years are both important. And the impact of ADHD on health and wellness and life expectancy is mediated primarily through the impact that it has on obesity, diabetes, substance use, and accidents. And what it means then is that in order to have a positive impact on those mediators of obesity, diabetes, substance use, and accidents, as well as some others, it's not simply a matter of targeting the obesity per se. It's a matter of first addressing the ADHD, because if you don't address the ADHD first, you're going to be climbing uphill in terms of doing something about it. Now, the reason why ADHD has such a big impact on these health outcomes and lots of other things that we know well in the world of world of research on ADHD is that ADHD makes it harder for folks to disengage from the present moment and instead to work towards future goals. So, the obvious example of this is if you've got a kid with a paper due on Friday and they procrastinate and they get caught up on their phone, they get caught up talking to their friends or playing with a dog or fiddling with their pencil rather than working towards the homework that's due on Friday. So I have this saying that, the unofficial slogan of ADHD time management is, by the time you feel it, it's too late. And this is especially true when it comes to a lot of these health outcomes. Like, it really is a situation that by the time you feel it, it's already too late. So once you've been smoking for 30 years and then you get lung cancer, it's too late to go back in time and change it. I wrote an article for Attitude on this topic of ADHD and time called ADHD Minds Are Trapped in Now, parenthesis, and Other Time Management Truths. So you can read a little bit more about it. I just did a webinar last night for ADA on this. I presented this some other places as well. But the basic idea is that folks with ADHD very much feel the present, but they don't feel the future as much. And this then has a significant impact on conscientiousness, in that healthy habits basically involve sacrificing in the present in order to have a better future, right? Nobody eats kale instead of chocolate chip cookies because the kale tastes better right now, right? We eat kale because it's good for us later. Now, hopefully it's not terrible in the eating, but like, people eat kale for the health effects and they do not eat chocolate chip cookies for the health effects. So we need to bring the future impact of our actions or inactions into the present moment in order to feel that and to then be motivated to do something about it. So we'll talk more specifically about a number of different health areas. So one of the implications of this is that if you want to improve your health and you're someone who has ADHD, it begins by addressing your ADHD. That trying to address these other health concerns first is going to make it much harder to be consistent and predictable and to kind of work the plan compared to if you do wind up addressing the ADHD first. It kind of brings us back to that famous old line from Russell Barkley that ADHD is not a disorder of knowing what to do. It's a disorder of doing what you know. So, for example, everybody with ADHD and everybody else in the world knows you should probably have like a healthy body weight. And to get that, you should probably exercise a bit more and eat a bit less, right? The knowing is super easy. It's the doing that's really hard because you don't just do it one time. You do it every single day, all week, all month, all year, all life, right? It's like many, 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 many times that you have to do this. So to treat ADHD then, frontline treatment, one of the most effective is stimulant medication. It really does tend to work pretty well for folks with ADHD. And as much as there are people who don't like the idea of medication, I think we need to consider this aspect of it also, that by not taking medication to treat your ADHD, it's not only affecting your grades if you're a kid, or your performance at work, or your relationship, or whatever. It's also impacting your physical body health. So one of the implications of this is if you have a treatment provider who kind of minimizes the ADHD and says, oh, you seem to be doing okay in your life. Are you sure you still need this medication? The answer is, yeah, I do. It's because of the medication that I'm doing well in my life. Why are we talking about taking me off it? You know, it's kind of like if you had diabetes and your blood sugar was well controlled and your doctor was like, seems like you're doing pretty good. Maybe we should, cut out this whole insulin thing, right? No, crazy. Nobody would suggest that. And yet with ADHD, too often they do. So generally speaking, we'll get into this, like I said, we'll get into the specifics in a little bit here. Generally speaking, in order to be more consistent about these kind of health maintenance habits that we're going to be talking about, we want to make it more likely. Like, we want to tip the odds. There's no guarantees and nobody's perfect, but we want to make it such that you are more likely to stick with those good habits and more likely to avoid the negative habits. So we can make good habits more likely. And, this applies to everybody in the world, but maybe a little bit especially applies to our ADHD folks, is make it easier to do it. So like lower the barriers to it. So for example, if you would like to eat healthier lunches, have healthier food available. Like if you actually get to the grocery store or have it delivered or however, if you actually have healthy food available, you're more likely to eat it compared to if you don't. Or if you bring healthy food to work, when the day once again comes and we can leave our houses for work, you're more likely to eat healthy stuff compared to if you don't bring it, you're more likely to eat junk. Definitely make it more enjoyable in the moment. So for example, if you need to work out more, how can you make the exercise more fun? So you're more likely to actually enjoy it. So it's not suffering in the moment so that you can get some vague, indistinct future benefit. Maybe you do it with somebody else. So for example, getting into bed together. Like, honey, I stay up too late. When you go to bed, make sure I come with you. In general, we all tend to do better when we do it with somebody else as well. Maybe you just create a habit of it. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I bring my workout stuff when I leave for work. So that way at lunch or on my way home or something, I can hit the gym, and it's a habit. It's a thing I do. I don't have to think about it. Certainly adding some variety, especially if you're the type of person with ADHD who kind of gets bored with the same old thing. Don't do the same old thing. So mix it up in terms of like what you're eating for lunch, how you get your exercise, whatever it is that you're doing, add some variety if that kind of keeps it fresh and interesting. And definitely make bad habits less likely. So I don't know, I had a friend of mine in grad school. This is an old example, but she smoked, but she didn't want to smoke that much. So she rolled her own cigarettes. If you have to roll every single cigarette, you're going to smoke a lot less than if you just pull one out of the pack. So that was an intentional choice on her part to smoke less. Let's talk about processes and outcomes. When it comes to any ongoing thing like maintaining good health, it's really about a good process. This is one of the reasons sometimes why diets don't work, because they might work in the short term, but if you don't change your life and how you live it, you wind up sliding right back. And the problem with focusing too much on the outcome of like, I'm going to start exercising, let's see how much weight I lose, or I'm going to change up my diet, let's see how much weight I lose, is outcomes tend to be too gradual and they take too long. And they're just not rewarding. Of like, wait a second, you're telling me I killed myself all week and I lost 1 pound? I can't even see that, right? So if you're looking for the outcome in that kind of impatient ADHD kind of a way, you're just not going to get enough of the outcome. So it's much better to focus on the process and to kind of take some pride, give yourself some credit for every small action that you do. Like every time you get to the gym, give yourself a little pat on the back. Every time you work out a little bit harder, give yourself a pat on the back. And when you fall off the trail, when you fall off the track and, hopefully not literally, but maybe even so, when you fall off, handle those setbacks resiliently, like get back on, brush yourself off, get back up. Don't get down on yourself. Don't throw in the towel. And keep in mind that good outcomes are based on a good process. If you have a generally good process and you generally work it, you will tend to get that good outcome that you're hoping for. So let's talk a little bit more specifically then about how ADHD impacts some of these areas and what it is that you can do about it. So getting enough sleep is hard. We all know you should get 8 hours of sleep or whatever, right? That's super easy to know it. The hard part is the doing. And unfortunately, even if you're terrible at sleeping, it's still important. And it really sets a foundation for both cognitive functioning in terms of complex thinking, attention, memory, learning, all of that, but also mood. So, I will speak for myself. I'm way more grumpy if I don't get a good night's sleep. But we're all more grumpy if we don't get a good night of sleep. Unfortunately, our friends with ADHD especially struggle with sleep. And again, the knowing is the easy part. The doing is the hard part. Some of the problem is there does seem to be this thing that folks with ADHD tend to be night owls. They just tend to drift towards later bedtimes, later wake-up times, which is fine if your life fits that, and it's not so fine if school starts at 7:30. Part of the issue also is that folks with ADHD tend to lose track of time or because they sort of hyper-focus. So even if you have the best laid plan of getting into bed at 10, let's say, if you get caught up in stuff, you lose track of time, the evening kind of drifts away and holy crap, it's midnight. How did that happen? Or just because of inefficiencies associated with ADHD, especially let's say if your meds have worn off at the end of the night, things just take longer and you just can't get into bed because you're not done with today, as well as the procrastination. So could have been done earlier, wasn't done earlier, now it's got to get done later. So the homework that doesn't get started till 9 o'clock, or the other stuff of adult life, so loading the dishwasher, making the kids lunches and whatever, that gets pushed later, and then, you just can't get into bed on time. But even if some of these folks do get into bed on time, they sometimes will lie there for an hour or two, where they just can't kind of turn their mind off enough to sort of drift down into sleep. So, for a lot of reasons, folks with ADHD struggle with getting enough sleep. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, actually making a commitment to value sleep. I know that's not the full solution. I'm not saying it's that simple. Sorry, that's my dog coughing here. So, I guess working from home. So making a commitment to value sleep, to say, this is important. I admit it. I know it. I need to do this. And not sort of talk yourself into believing this idea that you don't need more sleep. And we sometimes, we all tell ourselves little lies. This is a big one. I can stay up. I'll be fine. I only need 6 hours of sleep. I'm okay. Maybe, but probably not. So another idea here, maybe related to that, to make that commitment a little more tangible, is to create a bedtime. So to actually think about no, seriously, what's actually a reasonable bedtime for me? And then once you've created it, to actually honor it, to live that bedtime. This then creates the next idea, which is avoiding sleep cycle shifts. So meaning, let's say you say, my bedtime during the week is 11 p.m. and then I wake up around 7. That's great, except if on the weekends you stay up till 3 in the morning and sleep till noon. Now all of a sudden you've jet lagged yourself. You've put yourself, if you live on the East Coast, you're now on Alaska time or whatever is past Alaska. So it then shifts your cycle later again. And if you already tend to drift late, this is only going to make it that much worse. Definitely avoid engrossing activities at night, so stuff that you get caught up in, whether it's video games or one more Netflix episode or reading or whatever it is that you do. If you tend to get stuck there, maybe it's one of those things, if it's too hard to stop, maybe you just don't start. Maybe that's the better point of intervention. Certainly also, I mean, easy to say, but addressing inefficiencies earlier in the day. You know, like we talked about, like stuff creeps later into the night because it didn't get done earlier. Maybe the point of intervention is not the night, but it's what is or isn't getting done earlier and why. Maybe that's the place to put your focus. Because again, by the time you get to the night, it's too late. Like the die has been cast. Certainly getting into bed together, like if you both have something of a similar schedule in terms of when you have to go to bed and when you have to wake up, that can definitely be a good thing. Like you're just more likely to get there, especially if you tend to be the type of person who gets sort of stuck hyper-focusing on something, you lose track of time. And of course, if you and your partner get into bed together, I don't know, maybe there are other benefits to that habit that might come from it. There's a bunch, for the folks who have trouble just spinning down their mind, there's all sorts of relaxation or mindfulness or whatever audio out there or stuff on YouTube, but like, you know, don't look at the screen, that can help sort of occupy your mind. There's actually a podcast I heard about. I haven't had a chance to check it out, but it's called Sleep With Me. And this is a guy who kind of talks about kind of boring things in an effort to kind of hold enough of your attention that it draws you out of that spiral of your own thoughts and allows you to actually kind of drift off a little bit better. Maybe melatonin is helpful, but it's definitely not a sleeping pill, but it might be a thing that for some people who tend to shift towards later, taking it a couple hours before desired bedtime might actually help them shift their clock a little bit earlier, if that's a problem that you have. So let's talk about eating. It's really easy to eat unhealthy, and it's much harder to actually eat a healthy diet. Like a healthy diet really takes effort. It takes intentionality. It takes planning ahead, and not just planning ahead, but actually then like enacting that plan, and not just once, but across sort of like multiple moments. So for example, you go to the grocery store, you buy a bunch of healthy stuff. Well, then you need to actually have time to cook it. And then once you cook it, maybe you have to have time in the morning to like pack it up and bring it with you, for example. And you need to have, in order to cook in the first place, you might actually have to have run your day efficiently enough you can get home in an early enough time to actually make it. I mean, certainly a lot of times, like whenever we do takeout during the week, it's always because it's like a late day and we're running to soccer and whatever, we don't have enough time to cook. So like I totally see in our life, our unhealthy eating or taking food out is driven by time more so during the week at least than by I would really love tacos right now. Folks with ADHD who tend to hyperfocus will sometimes go hours without eating. And then by the time they finally realize, they're starving. And nobody makes good food choices when they're starving. So you're much more likely to eat too much, to eat the things that are delicious but not as healthy. Alternatively, kind of bored grazing at night. You know, you're awake, there's not much going on, you kind of need a little bit of stimulation. You know, let's see what's in the fridge. It just adds extra calories that you may not need. So how do we fight it? How do we counterbalance that? I mean, generally speaking, a healthy diet follows the basics. There's all sorts of crazy stuff out there and these miracle diets and all this like blah, blah, blah. But like ultimately at the end of the day, a healthy diet follows the basics. So you have the right balance of protein, carbs, and fats, minimize processed foods, eat a variety of things so you get plenty of nutrients, you know, all that kind of basic stuff. So you don't have to get too complicated. And there are definitely no shortcuts on this, unfortunately. When it comes to good food options, even though I'm a psychologist, I actually fairly often spend time talking to clients about specifically what they're eating, how they set it up, how they prepare it, whatever. Because the easier it is to eat healthy, the more likely you are to do it. The quicker it is, the more convenient, the more desirable the food options, the more likely you're going to go to that rather than pick something less healthy. Because again, we all tend to favor what's quick and easy and tasty in the moment rather than going to the thing that's less tasty in the moment but is probably healthier for us. So, if you try to do like the all celery diet, that's going to last like 20 minutes. Willpower alone will not give you a healthy diet. So try to find some options that are pretty good enough that you're much more likely to actually eat rather than being overambitious in things that are just unlikely to happen. Generally speaking, healthy proteins are the hardest to come by. They take the most amount of effort. Almost nobody has to try to get enough carbs. Almost nobody has to try to get enough fats. It's really the proteins that are the harder thing. The further you can stay away from unhealthy temptation, the less willpower it takes. So in other words, the place to not get the Doritos is in the supermarket. If the Doritos are in the pantry, it takes 1,000,000 times more willpower to not eat them. So leave it at the grocery store. Don't even walk down that aisle. Don't go into the convenience store because that's, the place that's full of junk food and it's just too tempting. So don't set yourself up for failure by putting yourself in a situation where it takes a ton of willpower to make the better choice. For folks who take stimulant meds and it kind of kills their appetite in the middle of the day, the advice I give, it's that same advice grandma's going to tell you, have a good breakfast. Like absolutely make a point of really getting in a good breakfast, which is good advice for everybody. But especially if you're going to be less hungry in the middle of the day, you don't want to be running on fumes by the end of the day. Maybe a full lunch, just like you just can't stomach it if you're on your meds. But what can you stomach? What can you at least get in a little bit of? What can you graze on in little bits through the day rather than doing like a traditional lunch? And then, make a point of eating more at night when your meds have worn off. And as long as you get in the right number of calories, the right healthy calories, it's really kind of fine. It doesn't matter if you don't have a full-size lunch, but at least you want a little bit of something. Let's talk about exercise. It's well known that exercise is good for your body. Duh, we all know that. But what's also equally important is that exercise benefits our cognition, so stuff like attention, learning, and memory, but also our mood, as well as our physical health. So, psychologically speaking, it benefits anxiety, depression, etc. So exercise is good for our bodies and also our brains. For folks with ADHD, it can definitely help with focus. You're probably more likely to be focused and attentive in, the few hours after a decent workout than you would have been if you didn't work out. It can definitely help with some of that restlessness to kind of get some of that energy out. But it also helps regulate sleep. And if you're someone who struggles with sleep, you might want to look at exercise as part of your interventions. Maybe you exercise early in the day, maybe you exercise at the end of the day or in the middle. Find out what works for you. When it comes to exercise, doing anything is better than doing nothing. So if you go to the gym and you do half of a workout, it's still half of a workout better than nothing of a workout. But having said that, and I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, but, when it comes to exercise, there's this idea of like, you got to mean it. So in other words, taking a walk around the neighborhood is great for a lot of reasons, and it's definitely better than just sitting on the couch. However, unless it really gets your heartbeat up, it may not be enough in terms of really getting the benefits of exercise. So you need to really be intentional. You got to mean it. You got to really do something. Now, when it comes to exercise, there's cardio stuff, and then there's weightlifting, just to separate into two categories. They're both important. They're not exactly the same, and ideally, you do at least some of both. Ironically, when it comes to losing fat, weightlifting is actually more effective. And the reason is when you build muscle by weightlifting, those muscles are constantly burning calories just to keep themselves alive. As opposed to if you do a lot of cardio, there's only so many hours you can run to burn off the stuff that you're eating. So cardio is much less efficient actually when it comes to losing weight, or specifically losing fat. So let's talk about how to make exercise more compelling. The big question for all of us, but especially for our friends with ADHD who tend to get bored of the same old thing more often, or tend to have a harder time motivating to do the stuff they don't feel like doing, is what's going to keep it the most amount of interesting. So, for example, do you do better in social settings? So like taking a class or doing like semi-private training at the gym, or, you know, doing some crazy like CrossFit thing? Like, is that the thing that's going to keep you most engaged? Or do you do better doing just private stuff on your own? Like, I like to go down and bang it out on the treadmill, or I like to go to the gym and just put on my headphones and not have to think about it. Either way, like, all of this is good. It's just a question of, for you, what's going to keep it most interesting? What's going to keep you doing it the most? Do you like it to be play-oriented, so like, you know, an adult soccer league, for example? Or do you want a more structured, like, here's a real exercise program? Like, I'm doing, you know, this much with bench, and then I'm doing this much with squats, and then I'm doing whatever. Do you prefer to be self-directed, as in, I'm just going to run my own show here? Or you want to be guided? Like, do you want a trainer giving you a program? Do you want it to be using an app or some other kind of a thing? I have a friend of mine I was talking to who says he doesn't have ADHD, but I think he does. And we're talking about working out with a trainer. He works out with a trainer every time. And he says, no. I'm voice activated. If I don't have someone standing next to me telling me what to do, I won't do it. So like, he knows himself well enough to know the way for him to get awesome workouts is to have a trainer standing there with him. So good for him. That is a success. Do you like to exercise in silence? Do you like having music? Do you like having a podcast going? Do you like, you know, watching TV or videos or whatever? Whatever is going to keep you motivated, keep you engaged, keep you doing it, do that thing. Or maybe you like mixing it up, you know, so sometimes you do a class, sometimes you go out for a run by yourself, sometimes you do this, or for a while, you know, you get in a kick where you're doing this thing, but then that gets boring, and then you go do something else. It doesn't matter what you're doing as long as it's good quality stuff. In general, to be consistent, to actually get it done often enough, 3 to 5 times a week, you probably need to plan the time. And I know folks with ADHD hate that, but you probably do. And usually, the earlier in the day you do it, the less likely it is to get bumped by other things that are going on. So that doesn't mean you have to wake up at 5 in the morning, but just generally, the earlier in the day that you do it, the more likely it is to happen. Then, in the interest of kind of bringing the future into the present, as we talked about, notice how you feel afterwards. How do you perform cognitively? What's your attention? How do you do with getting things done? In terms of your alertness and energy level, how do you feel afterwards? So that is then perhaps motivation to show up again next time. So it's not this vague thing, if I work out today, I'll have some, you know, indistinct benefit in my distant future, but kind of like, if I work out now, in an hour, afterwards, like, I'm going to feel better. Like, I'm going to get way more done. So it kind of gives you a more immediate payoff, which is more motivating for everybody. Let's talk briefly about substance use. So, you know, this obviously means like big illegal drugs, but it also means marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, or nicotine in the age of vaping. So here's the thing. We all have our vices. We all have our things we do too much. We all have our things that we eat or drink or whatever that are not as healthy as they could be. So, you know, maybe chocolate chip cookies is your thing, or maybe like in our house here, like, seem to be eating a lot more ice cream in the age of COVID than we ever did before that. You know, you don't have to live a Spartan lifestyle. You don't have to live like a monk. But then again, you don't want to live like motley crew either, and die young. So like somewhere in between those, we need to find our balance point, and all of us need to figure out what's the risk and what's the reward. And some of that might depend on your specific condition. So like, what's your family history of heart disease? What's your family history of addictions? You might have different odds than somebody else. But it's not just the long-term effect. It might also be more immediate. So like, if I have a drink with dinner, I can tell I'm probably more tired the rest of the night. I'm not stumbling and I'm not yelling and breaking things, but like I'm just a little bit less engaged than if I didn't have a drink, which doesn't mean that I never have a drink, because I do, but I just know that as a thing to accept and acknowledge to myself that this is part of the package deal. We know that folks with ADHD are more likely to run into substance abuse problems. So you need to ask yourself the question, if you're drinking, smoking, vaping, whatever, and maybe you're doing it a little bit more than you think you should, or you're doing it a little bit more than somebody else thinks that you should, is it self-medicating? Are you medicating anxiety, depression, boredom, conflict, whatever? And if so, maybe it's better to get to the root of it than it is to keep doing the thing that's self-medicating. Roberto Olivardia did a podcast. He did a webinar for Attitude, I don't know, like a month ago, something, on marijuana and the ADHD brain. And he did a really good job. He pulled all the research, really talked about it. I'm going to give you the short answer. Marijuana is not good for your brain. It's definitely not good for your brain if you're under 25 and your brain is still developing. So you can, I don't know, you can listen to that one. It's episode 288 to get some more information about it. Coming down the home stretch here, let's talk about treatment compliance. So not necessarily complying with ADHD treatment, but complying with other treatments. Like depending on what our health conditions are, sometimes it's not simply a matter of like, here's an antibiotic, take it for 3 days. Sometimes this is like a thing you need to do every day for the rest of your life, to like managing diabetes, let's say, or it's a thing that you need to do like for a while. So like I hurt my shoulder at the gym, wound up with a frozen shoulder. I've had to do PT every day, kind of a pain. Not forever, but it's been a while, right? So if you tend to get distracted, if you're forgetful, if you don't remember the questions to ask, write them down so you don't have to hold them in your mind, just like we make the recommendation in general for lots of other circumstances. Or write down what the doctor or the nurse or the PT or the whoever is saying, like take notes, don't just rely on holding it in mind. Or maybe bring a family member. They can be helpful in remembering what was said. Then that's a good way to kind of supplement your internal memory. Creating a structure or routine or reminder, whatever, for taking your medication. Sometimes the best way to remember that is to peg it to some existing habit. So like if you presumably you always brush your teeth in the morning, you put your meds next to your toothbrush, or you put them next to the coffee maker, or you put them at the dinner table because that's the place that you're supposed to take them. So you peg it to something you're already doing. If there's a follow-up appointment to be made, if you need to set up, a schedule of time at the lab to get blood drawn or whatever, don't run out of the office and then say, oh, I'll do that later. Maybe that's the thing, you schedule it like in the waiting room, or you go out to your car and on your phone in the parking lot, you go ahead and schedule it so that you know that it happens. And when you do it, when you schedule it, put everything into your schedule. So like the address of the lab facility, or the authorization number, or take a picture of the prescription, or whatever. So you don't run into that problem of like, at the last minute trying to find those bits and pieces. Let's do one more slide here. We're going to talk about how to live a healthy life in the midst of quarantine. So quarantine makes some things easier and it makes some things harder. So for example, we haven't eaten out in a month or something. So like that's a plus for us. Don't have to try that hard on that one. But then other things are harder. Like I'm working out in the basement. I'm not going to the gym. some of this is going to be temporary. It's unclear how long, and we don't know exactly, when it will be over, but it will not be forever. But at least for now, this is the reality that we have. Some of my clients, who feel like they're just sort of adrift in their day and the days blend into weeks kind of thing, which is a really easy place to be. Maybe the thing you do is you use some of these healthy habits to kind of structure your otherwise now unstructured day. So like get into bed at this time, get out of bed at that time, make yourself breakfast, do whatever the thing is, then you work out at noon or whatever. Like use these healthy habits as placeholders, as sort of markers for the other time points in your day. And this might be a good time to get into the habit of like, I don't know, trying some healthy recipes to cook, or to, if you're able to like leave the house and go for a run every day or a few times a week. You might have to get creative in terms of what you're doing because, again, these are strange times, but that's okay. And, if you're one of those ADHD people who's like super creative, run with it. Come up with creative solutions for the strange times that we live in. Ultimately, it's important because this stuff is not all or nothing. Ultimately, it's important to keep in mind that partial progress is still progress. Even if you're just eating healthier some of the time, that might still be a measurable difference. That might still be worth it. I'm not saying you can't always aspire to a little bit more, but at a certain point, doing something is still better than doing nothing. And when you fall off, get back on the horse. Like, do not give up too early. Don't throw in the towel. Don't say, well, I didn't run this week, so I guess I'm not running next week. It's always about what can I do next? Regardless of what happened yesterday, what can I do today? And that's especially true for these kind of lifelong, ongoing things like living a healthy lifestyle. And the goal of living a healthy lifestyle is not moral superiority or whatever. It's about, if I live a healthy life, I will feel better, I'll have more energy, and I will be able to do more of the things that are important to me. Like, it is, to some extent, it is a means to an end. And that's like the big picture that we're working towards. So let's take some questions.
Okay, good. Several people have brought up having an emotionally balanced life, how their emotions, we all know that ADHDers feel emotions strongly, anger, etc., sadness, this, that, and how that can undercut even the best of habits. So the question is, how does one go about sort of regulating their emotions a little more healthily?
Right. So I think that's an awesome question. The thing of it is, so first of all, yes, folks with ADHD do tend to kind of feel their emotions a little bit more strongly. They kind of wear their emotions on their sleeve a little bit more. And that's just part of ADHD, and it just is what it is, right? It's not good, it's not bad, it just is what it is. But there's definitely a lot about unmanaged ADHD that can exacerbate that emotionality, especially the more negative emotions, meaning like anger, impatience, irritability. So not getting enough sleep, feeling overwhelmed like you have too much going on, feeling guilty about the stuff that you missed deadlines on, or procrastinating and then being in a panic to catch up. So managing your ADHD better in general, and again, easy to say, will help with some of that emotionality. But also, so will exercise. Like that can have a moderating effect on especially our more negative emotions. If some of your irritability comes from low blood sugar, for example, then eating a bit of a healthier diet can be helpful. It could also be a thing where you get to a point of recognizing, I feel really kind of stressed out and on edge. I really need to get to the gym, or I need to go for a run, or even I just need to drop and do 10 push-ups. So to use some of these habits, both preemptively to set a better foundation for your emotions, but also like in response to your emotions, and to really notice and look for perhaps the times that you use like unhealthy eating or substance use as a way to kind of treat, so to speak, those stronger negative emotions. And when you find yourself going there, maybe you go do something else instead, or a bit of mindfulness or something else to sort of take down those negative emotions rather than relying on unhealthier options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good advice. Several people who are in quarantine have brought up the fact that they have an abundance of exercise options, online classes, videos, apps, YouTube, etc. But they're having the classic challenge of not being able to get started. So, I mean, getting started on some of these things. Do you have any strategies for that?
Definitely. So, and absolutely, there is a lot of stuff available online these days, including, you know, personal trainers and other folks like that. Like the trainers that I use are doing stuff on Zoom these days. So, so first, you know, my advice is kind of like I was saying before, find something that's going to be the most enjoyable. And maybe it's not like the most fun you ever have, but if it's a class that you really just kind of hate, don't sign up for it. Try to find something that is entertaining enough that it doesn't feel like a death march to get yourself to do it. So find stuff that's interesting and enjoyable to do in the process. Set yourself up for success by thinking about like, okay, what's the best time of day for me to do this? And if the idea is I'll do it at 5 o'clock, but then the day just runs away or the kids are hungry or whatever, and it's just like, you know, maybe 5 o'clock is not the time to schedule the exercise class. Or even like, you know, if you can get away with this, depending on what kind of video calls you need to do for work, getting dressed in your gym clothes. So you're already that like one step earlier to do it. Sometimes it's also a matter of making good food choices beforehand so that you're not like starving by the time you're supposed to work out and then you'd rather eat something. So there's a bunch of things you can do to kind of tilt the odds and set yourself up for success. There's something also to be said for kind of a little bit of social pressure to sort of tell your partner or some friends or whatever of like, I need to start working out. I'm doing this class at 12. Ask me if I did it. Now, it's not their job, and you definitely don't want to set up like a parent-child dynamic, but a little bit of that kind of social pressure can be a good thing, especially if it's like a mutual accountability thing.
Mm-hmm. Several people who are not taking stimulants, you mentioned how stimulants could help in terms of sticking to some of these habits you mentioned. Well, several people are unable to take stimulants, and they said, is there an additional habit or step that can be implemented for us who are not on medication? I don't know.
Right.
Maybe a coach. I don't know. I'm just throwing some stuff out.
Yeah, and you know, there are indeed like there's a smaller percentage of people who can't take a stimulant for whatever reason, or they've tried them all and just none of them work. So that's just one of those unfortunate, you know, hands to be dealt. So in that case, I mean, there are some non-stimulants. They're generally not as effective, but maybe there's a bit of benefit to be had. But I think it just means that you then need to be that much more diligent about the rest of your good habits. Just like someone who takes medication still needs to be diligent about the rest of those good habits, but you need to be especially diligent. Certainly, you know, stuff like working with a coach or a therapist or some other accountability partner can be helpful in terms of providing some of that external structure if it's harder to provide internal structure on your own. So, you know, but, you know, I think also, and this is really kind of cause and effect, but really as best you can, managing these lifestyle factors. And I know I said it's harder to manage them if your ADHD isn't well managed, and that is true, but to really be diligent about getting enough sleep, about eating at least healthy enough, about exercising. I had a client who did a ton of exercise as a way to treat his ADHD, and then finally came to a point where his life was too complicated and he decided to go on medication. But, for some people, maybe that provides enough of the benefit that your life is actually still pretty good.
Have you, people are wondering if you've had clients who because as in their case, they managed to eat healthy for a month, exercise, do well for 2 months, and, get some reasonable sleep, but they find the whole thing boring. We all know about boredom and ADHD. So I don't know if you have any, anti-boredom strategies once people get into this, but find it a little too, not exciting enough.
Yeah. And, I have a young guy with ADHD who I was talking to last week about, I suggested, he was having trouble exercising. So I said, what if you start listening to some podcasts or something while you're exercising? So he did it. And then he comes back. He says, I listened to the podcast while I was working out and it was okay. But then, I listened to the podcast when I wasn't working out and I was like, actually, I enjoyed this more. Right. So there's no magic formula on this. And absolutely, exercise, especially if it's the same old thing, for some people can definitely get really boring, and especially for our folks with ADHD. So, I would challenge you then to really think about what will make exercise interesting, what actually makes it interesting for me to be able to maintain it. And it may be that it's really about variety, that you kind of mix it up. There's no rule that you have to stick to one thing and only do that. So maybe for a while you're doing kickboxing, and then after that you're doing spin classes, and then after that you're, doing some weightlifting routine, and then after that you're doing some other things. So, mixing it up might keep it more interesting to you. There are, some of these like CrossFit and Tough Mudder and other things like that, some of these kind of group programs. I think where they can be really good is at motivating people, engaging them, keeping them coming back. That's the good news about it. The potential bad news is sometimes they push people too hard and there's a lot of injuries that come out of it. So you need to know yourself well. And hopefully look for a program that doesn't push everyone to the max and then, people get hurt. So, but, maybe that's going to be a thing that's going to keep you more engaged. But it may just be at a certain point, sometimes you just need to do it anyway. And often when it comes to stuff like exercise, it's the first minute that's the hardest. It's the getting there and the getting started that's the hardest. And maybe you need to remind yourself, you know what, once I'm 5 minutes in, it's actually going to be not too bad. And then I'm going to feel good that I'm doing it. I just need to get over that first few minutes. I just need to get there.
Mm-hmm. A fair number of people have comorbid conditions, anxiety and depression, along with their ADHD, making it fairly tough to embrace some of these healthy habits. So any advice here? Make sure that maybe that the comorbid condition is properly treated before, or whatever.
No, definitely. It's absolutely true. Anxiety and depression both will sap your motivation or reduce your ability to do some of these things that really would be good for you. And it's that kind of unfortunate irony that anxiety and depression both benefit from exercise, and yet they also make it harder to exercise, as well as to get enough sleep and eat healthy and all of that. So, part of it might be, to address, to treat, whether through medication or therapy or whatever, that anxiety and depression explicitly. But it may also be, some of it might be that if you can get yourself over that hump and get into some of these better habits, you might also then have that secondary benefit on the anxiety and depression. But, I think it's important to recognize the fact that depression is going to make you feel like certain things aren't worth it, or you're going to be more down on yourself of like, even if I go work out, what difference is it going to make anyway? Or I'm not going to look any better, or I won't be able to stick with it. So what's the point? So depression kind of lies to us by exaggerating the negatives or the more pessimistic view on it. And anxiety lies to us as well. If it's telling you things like, you go to the exercise class, you're not going to know what you're doing, you're going to look like a fool, everyone's going to be watching you, which is really a lie because nobody's watching you. They're trying to, keep up themselves. So, so to recognize that what your anxiety and depression is telling you is not actually true. And sometimes it's that kind of do it anyway sort of a thing. And to really kind of push yourself to do what it is that you need to do and have faith that you'll feel better on the other side of it.
Mm-hmm. Once again, several people have brought up melatonin. They've tried to use it. I know you're not a doctor, but they have trouble finding the right dose. A lot of them have started at a very high dose. And so is there some experimentation or an expert that they should talk with before engaging in melatonin for good sleep, or?
Yeah, the thing about melatonin is melatonin has a lot of press, so to speak, but it's not, I don't know, it's not necessarily as effective as some of the advertisers would lead you to believe. So, like I mentioned, it's not a sleeping pill. It's not like you take a melatonin and then you get tired in half an hour, then you fall asleep. What it does is it's helpful for stuff like jet lag. It's helpful for shift workers with weird changing schedules. But it's also helpful maybe to shift your sleep a little bit earlier. So if you tend to be a night owl, but you have to get into bed earlier because you have to unfortunately wake up earlier, it might make you tired a little bit earlier. Generally speaking, what you need is about 1 milligram. Now, what happens is manufacturers started selling 3 milligram pills because 3 is clearly better than 1. And then they started selling 5 milligram pills because that's even better. Clearly 5 is better than 3. But it's not necessarily. It's like a little bit is better, but only to a point. So, sometimes people feel groggy in the morning because they're sort of overdosed a little bit. They still have too much in their system. So generally the advice is take 1 milligram a couple hours before your desired bedtime, which is not ideal because, if you want to go to bed at 11, you almost have to set an alarm for 9 because it's really easy to miss that 9 o'clock window. So, that might be a thing that's helpful because if you take it at bedtime, it's not going to do its thing at bedtime. It takes a bit longer than that to do its thing. So, that would be my advice. And to make sure that you're buying melatonin that has that little USP logo on it, because the problem with a lot of the supplements is what it says on the bottle is not necessarily what's in the pill. It's just not that well regulated. So if you see the USP mark on it, at least you know that it is what it's supposed to be.
Right. Well, I think the hour is up, Ari. So great stuff, lots of strategies and insights, and really appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise on this.
Well, my pleasure. I think that this is a really important topic. This is something that us in the world of ADHD, I think, are going to be putting out there a lot more as a way to make it clear that ADHD is serious stuff. And we want people with ADHD and their families to live long, healthy, happy lives.
Right. Exactly. Thanks once again, and have a great day. And
thank you.
Thanks to all of the attendees for listening in. We'll see you next week on April 15th, when Roberto Olivardia will talk about making the decision to medicate your child with ADHD. It ought to be a good one. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Stay well.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit AttitudeMag.com. That's AdditudeMag.com. That's AdditudeMag.com. That's AdditudeMag.com.